Welcome, dear listener, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, your sanctuary for peaceful nights and wandering dreams. I'm your narrator, and tonight, as the world settles into stillness around you, I invite you to journey with me across time itself, to a place where legend and history dance together like shadows on ancient stone. Here on Mystic Bedtime Stories, we believe that the most profound rest comes not from emptying the mind, but from filling it with wonder. Each story we share is crafted to guide you gently into sleep, weaving together history, mythology, and the timeless questions that have stirred human hearts for millennia. Whether you're seeking escape from the day's burdens, or simply craving the comfort of a voice in the darkness, you've found your home. Tonight, we embark on perhaps our most ambitious journey yet. Over the next 2 hours, we'll walk together through the ruins of one of history's most captivating cities. We'll stand where heroes once stood, breathe the same salt air that filled the lungs of kings and poets, and explore the thin boundary between what was real and what was dreamed. Picture yourself now, if you will, settling into the soft sand of an ancient beach. The Aegean Sea stretches endlessly before you, its waters catching the last silver light of evening. This is the coast of what we now call Turkey, but 3,000 years ago, this shoreline witnessed events that would echo through every generation that followed. Behind you, on a hill overlooking the sea, stand the remnants of massive stone walls. These are not the walls of just any ancient city. These weathered blocks once formed the mighty fortifications of Troy, a place that exists simultaneously in 3 realms. In the ground beneath your feet, where archaeologists have uncovered layer upon layer of human habitation. In the pages of Homer's immortal epic, where gods walked among mortals and heroes fought for love and honor. And in the realm of human imagination, where Troy has lived for nearly 3 millennia, as a symbol of everything we build, everything we love, and everything we ultimately lose. As you lie here on this imaginary beach, feeling the cool evening breeze carry the scent of wild herbs and ancient stone, you might wonder, what really happened here? Was there truly a beautiful queen named Helen, whose face launched 1,000 ships? Did a warrior named Achilles rage across these plains in golden armor? Did the Greeks really hide inside a wooden horse to breach these very walls? Tonight, we won't simply tell you what scholars believe or what poets have sung. Instead, we'll explore something far more interesting, how the story of Troy became woven so deeply into the human soul that it continues to speak to us across the centuries. We'll discover how a city that may have fallen before the pyramids were ancient has somehow remained eternally young in our collective memory. You see, Troy is not just a place that existed in the Bronze Age, nor is it merely a creation of poetic imagination. Troy exists in that mysterious space where history and myth converge, where archaeological evidence meets emotional truth, where the concrete facts of human existence touch the eternal questions of human meaning. As we explore together tonight, you'll feel the weight of real stone blocks quarried by real hands, and you'll also sense the shimmer of divine intervention that Homer painted across his verses. You'll walk with flesh and blood warriors who lived and died 3,000 years ago, and you'll also encounter the archetypal heroes who represent the deepest patterns of human experience. So close your eyes now and let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of these eternal waves. Feel yourself sinking back through time, past the bustling airports and highways of modern Turkey, past the Ottoman palaces and Byzantine churches, past the Roman roads and Hellenistic temples, back to an age when the Mediterranean was truly the center of the known world, and when the fate of kingdoms could hang on the honor of a single warrior or the beauty of a single woman. In just a moment, we'll begin our journey properly, starting with the fundamental question that has puzzled scholars and dreamers alike. What exactly was Troy? But for now, simply rest here on this timeless shore, listening to waves that have been whispering the same secrets for 3,000 years. Let your mind drift like sea foam, ready to be shaped by the ancient stories that are about to unfold. Welcome to Troy. Welcome to the place where myth and history embrace. Welcome to a story that has been waiting 3 millennia to be told again, just for you, on this quiet night when the modern world has finally fallen silent enough for us to hear the whispers of eternity. And now our story truly begins. As dawn breaks over our imaginary vigil on the Aegean shore, we find ourselves facing a question that has captivated human minds for over 2,000 years. What exactly is Troy? Is it the golden-walled city of Homer's imagination, where gods ascended from Mount Olympus to tip the scales of war? Is it the archaeological site that German businessman Heinrich Schliemann claimed to discover in the 1870s? Or is it something more elusive still, a place that exists primarily in the realm of human longing and collective memory? Let us begin with what we can touch and measure. If you were to visit northwestern Turkey today, you would find yourself driving through rolling countryside dotted with olive groves and wheat fields. The landscape is peaceful now, pastoral in the way that former battlefields often become, as if the earth itself seeks to heal old wounds with green growth and the simple rhythms of agricultural life. Near the town of Nanicali, not far from where the Dardanelles Strait connects the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, you would come upon a modest hill called Hisarlik. The name means place of fortresses in Turkish, a fitting designation for a site that has been continuously occupied for over 4,000 years. Here, rising about 100 feet above the surrounding plain, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of not one city, but 9 distinct settlements, each built upon the ruins of its predecessor like chapters in a very long book written in stone and pottery shards. Asterisk, the oldest of these cities, which scholars call Troy I, was established around 3000 BCE, making it contemporary with the first dynasties of ancient Egypt and the earliest Sumerian cities of Mesopotamia. Picture, if you will, a small Bronze Age settlement, its inhabitants working bronze and copper, raising sheep and cattle, trading across the eastern Mediterranean. These were accomplished people, these first Trojans, skilled in crafts and commerce, but their lives would have seemed impossibly remote from the epic dramas that later poets would project onto their landscape as centuries passed, each successive. Troy grew larger and more sophisticated than the last. Troy, too, built around 2600 BCE, boasted impressive fortification walls and a great gate that archaeologists romantically dubbed the Gate of the Citadel. Troy VI, constructed around 1700 BCE, featured the most massive defensive walls of all, some sections still standing 16 feet high after 3.5 millennia, built with such skill that later Greeks would attribute their construction to the gods themselves. But it is Troy VIIA, dating to approximately 1180 BCE, that has captured the imagination of those who seek the real Troy of legend. This city shows clear evidence of destruction by fire, of hasty repairs to its walls, of storage jars buried, and house floors as if the inhabitants were preparing for a siege. Could this be Homer's Troy, the city that fell to Greek cunning and the famous wooden horse? Yet even as we examine these tangible remains, we must remember that Troy exists in realms beyond archaeology. For most of human history, Troy was not a place you could visit, but a story you could experience, not a destination, but a state of mind. When the Roman poet Virgil wrote his Aeneid, he was not describing a historical event, but using the fall of Troy as a metaphor for loss, exile, and the painful birth of new civilizations. When medieval writers told tales of Trojan heroes, they were not attempting historical accuracy, but exploring timeless themes of love, honor, betrayal, and heroic death. Consider how strange this is. A city that may have been destroyed 3,000 years ago has remained more alive in human consciousness than most places that still exist today. Troy has been painted by Renaissance masters, staged by Shakespeare's contemporaries, filmed by Hollywood directors, and referenced by poets in languages that did not exist when the historical city fell. It has become a template for understanding how civilizations rise and fall, how personal choices can have cosmic consequences, how beauty and desire can reshape the world. This is because Troy, whether historical or mythical, speaks to something fundamental in human experience. We all know what it feels like to have something precious under siege. We all understand the tension between loyalty and desire, between duty and passion. We all live in cities of our own making, fortified by our beliefs and relationships, yet vulnerable to forces beyond our control. In ancient Greek, the word for Troy was Ilion or Ilias, from which Homer derived the title of his great epic, the Iliad, but the Greeks also knew the city by another name, Troy, which some scholars believe comes from a word meaning turning or twisting. How perfect that Troy should be named for transformation, for the way stories change in the telling, the way history bends under the weight of human imagination, the way myth and reality spiral around each other like dancers who can never quite embrace. As you rest now in the darkness of your own chamber, thousands of miles and thousands of years from the windswept hill of Hisarlik, you are part of Troy's continuing story. Every time someone wonders about the price of beauty, the cost of pride, the tragedy of war, or the power of love to reshape destiny, Troy lives again. Every time we ask whether our own struggles have meaning beyond their immediate consequences, we are asking the same questions that Homer asked when he sat by firelight nearly 3 millennia ago, weaving together stories he had heard from earlier generations of storytellers. So what is Troy? It is all of these things and none of them completely. It is the archaeological site where real people lived and died in the Bronze Age. It is the literary creation that gave us our first great war epic. It is the eternal symbol of human ambition and human fragility. It is the place where history and story meet, where the factual and the mythical discover they have always been dancing together as we prepare to enter more deeply into Troy's story. Remember that you are not just learning about the past. You are participating in one of humanity's longest-running conversations about what it means to be human, what it costs to love deeply, what it requires to live with honor, and what remains when everything we build eventually crumbles to dust. Tomorrow's archaeologists may uncover new evidence about the historical Troy. Future poets may find fresh ways to retell its story. But tonight, in this quiet hour between waking and sleeping, Troy belongs to you as much as it ever belonged to anyone. You are walking the same paths of imagination that have been worn smooth by millions of footsteps across 3,000 years. The question is no longer what Troy was, but what it will become in your dreams. In the gathering twilight of ancient Greece, when the day's work was done and families gathered around their hearths, there would sometimes appear a figure walking the dusty roads between villages. He carried no sword, no shield, no merchants, goods. His only possessions were a simple staff, a worn cloak, and something far more precious than gold, thousands upon thousands of lines of poetry, all held perfectly in his memory. This was a rhapsode, a professional storyteller. And if the village was fortunate, he might know the greatest story ever told about the greatest war ever fought. He would settle by the fire, accept a cup of wine and a portion of bread, and then, as the flames danced and the stars emerged overhead, he would begin to speak words that had been passed down from master to student for generations uncounted. Sing, goddess of Achilles' rage, black and murderous. That cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades' dark, and left their bodies carrion for the dogs and birds. With these opening lines, we enter the world of Homer's Iliad, the foundation stone of Western literature, and our primary window into the Troy of legend. Yet even as we speak Homer's name, we must acknowledge one of literature's greatest mysteries. We know almost nothing certain about the man himself. Was Homer a single individual, or the name we give to a tradition of oral poets? Did he live in the 8th century BCE, as most scholars believe, or earlier, or later? Was he truly blind, as ancient tradition claimed, or is this simply a romantic embellishment that has grown around his memory like ivy around an ancient column? We may never know. But what we do know is that someone, somewhere, sometime in the dimming light of the Greek Dark Ages, created something unprecedented in human literature, a story so perfectly balanced between divine intervention and human psychology, between cosmic scope and intimate detail, that it has never been surpassed. The Iliad is not, as many believe, the story of the entire Trojan War. Homer was too sophisticated an artist for such sprawling ambition. Instead, he chose to focus on just 51 days near the end of the 10-year conflict, using this narrow window to illuminate the eternal themes that make war both glorious and terrible, both necessary and tragic. Picture the structure of Homer's epic as you might picture a great cathedral. The central pillar, supporting everything else, is the rage of Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, whose wounded pride sets in motion a chain of events that will determine the fate of two civilizations. Around this central column, Homer arranges his other themes like elaborate carvings: the honor culture of Bronze Age warriors, the intervention of gods in human affairs, the price of glory, the tenderness that can exist even between enemies, and the way individual choices ripple outward to reshape entire worlds. But what makes Homer's achievement truly remarkable is not just what he chose to include, but how he chose to tell it. Remember, this was not a written composition in our modern sense. The Iliad emerged from a culture of oral poetry, where stories were not read but performed, not preserved in books, but carried in human memory. Every line had to be memorable, every scene had to be vivid, every character had to be instantly recognizable even to listeners, who might hear them mentioned only once. To accomplish this seemingly impossible task, Homer developed techniques that still influence storytelling today. He created formulaic epithets, repeated phrases that helped both poet and audience. Swift-footed Achilles, Hector of the glinting helm, rosy-fingered Dawn. These were not simply decorative flourishes, but mnemonic devices, verbal landmarks that helped guide listeners through the vast landscape of the story. He also perfected the technique of epic simile, those extended comparisons that pause the action to illuminate character or emotion. When Homer wants us to understand Achilles' rage, he doesn't simply tell us the warrior is angry. Instead, he compares him to a lion whose cubs have been stolen, to a forest fire consuming everything in its path, to a dark star that brings disaster to mortals. These similes work like slow-motion photography, allowing us to examine crucial moments from multiple angles. Perhaps most importantly, Homer understood something that many later writers forgot, that the greatest stories are not about events, but about people. Yes, the Iliad contains magnificent battle scenes, divine interventions, and moments of high drama that have thrilled audiences for nearly 3 millennia. But at its heart, it is a profoundly human story about what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice, and what we lose in the process. Consider the famous scene where the Trojan prince Hector prepares to face Achilles in single combat, knowing he will almost certainly die. Homer could have focused on the martial details, the clash of bronze on bronze, the technical aspects of Bronze Age warfare. Instead, he shows us Hector saying goodbye to his wife Andromache and their infant son. When Hector reaches for the child, the baby is frightened by his father's war helmet and begins to cry. So Hector removes the helmet, takes his son in his arms, and prays to the gods that the boy will grow up to be an even greater warrior than his father. That is a moment of such tender humanity that it takes your breath away, made all the more poignant because we know that within hours, Hector will be dead, Troy will fall, and this child will be hurled from the city walls by the conquering Greeks. Homer understood that the true tragedy of war is not the death of warriors, who at least die with honor, but the destruction of the innocent, the unraveling of the domestic world that gives meaning to all the heroic posturing. This is why the Iliad has survived when so many other ancient works have vanished. Homer was not simply recording the legends of Bronze Age heroes. He was exploring the fundamental tensions of human existence, the conflict between individual desire and social obligation, between the longing for glory and the need for love, between our heroic aspirations and our mortal limitations. In every generation since Homer's time, people have found themselves reflected in his characters. Medieval knights saw themselves in Hector's chivalry. Renaissance princes identified with Achilles' magnificent rage. Romantic poets found in Helen a symbol of beauty's power to reshape the world. Modern readers discover in the Iliad the same questions that trouble us today. What price are we willing to pay for our principles? How do we maintain our humanity in the face of violence? What legacy do we leave for our children? As you settle deeper into sleep tonight, consider this remarkable fact. You are participating in one of humanity's oldest continuous cultural practices. For nearly 3,000 years, people have been gathering in the darkness to hear Homer's story retold. The medium has changed from firelight performances to written manuscripts to printed books to digital recordings, but the essential experience remains the same. In the quiet of night, we open our hearts to receive a story that has been deemed worthy of preservation across 100 generations. Homer's Troy is not a place you can visit with a guidebook and a camera. It exists in the realm of imagination, in the space that opens up when perfectly chosen words meet an attentive human consciousness. It is a Troy where gods walk among mortals, where honor matters more than life, where a single moment of choice can echo through eternity. And yet, paradoxically, this imagined Troy may be more real than the archaeological remains on the hill at Hisarlik. For Homer's Troy lives and breathes and changes every time someone encounters his story. It grows with each reader's understanding, deepens with each generation's questions, adapts to each culture's needs while somehow remaining eternally itself. Tomorrow, we will meet some of the individuals who populate Homer's Troy, beginning with the woman whose beauty was said to have launched 1,000 ships. But tonight, as sleep begins to claim you, you might imagine yourself sitting by that ancient fire, listening to a voice that bridges the gap between our world and the age of heroes, carrying forward words that refuse to die because they speak to something immortal in the human heart. The song continues, as it always has, as it always will. In all the vast tapestry of human storytelling, few figures have captured the imagination quite like Helen of Troy. For nearly 3,000 years, poets have struggled to find words adequate to describe her beauty. Painters have despaired of capturing her likeness, and storytellers have debated whether she was civilization's greatest victim or its most dangerous weapon. Tonight, as we walk through the shadowed corridors of myth and memory, let us try to understand not just who Helen was, but what she has come to represent in the deepest chambers of human consciousness. The story begins, as many ancient tales do, with the gods meddling in mortal affairs. At a wedding feast on Mount Pelion, the goddess Discord, angry at not being invited, cast a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest," among the assembled deities. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom; and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Unable to decide between them, Zeus appointed a mortal judge, Paris, a prince of Troy, who was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, unaware of his royal birth. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe. Hera promised him dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in battle. But Aphrodite with a smile that had launched more than ships, promised him something more immediately appealing, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, young and ruled by desire, rather than wisdom, awarded the apple to Aphrodite. In that moment, the fate of two civilizations was sealed. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus and the mortal woman Leda, raised in the court of Sparta. Even as a child, her beauty was so extraordinary that heroes came from across Greece seeking her hand in marriage. Her earthly father, King Tyndareus, faced an impossible dilemma. How could he choose one suitor without making enemies of all the others? The solution came from Odysseus, cleverest of the Greeks, who suggested that all the suitors swear an oath to defend whichever man Helen chose as her husband. This seemed reasonable enough, and so the oath was sworn. Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, a decent man if not the most charismatic of her suitors. For a time, their marriage appeared happy. Helen bore Menelaus a daughter named Hermione, and peace reigned in Sparta's sun-warmed halls. But the judgment of Paris had set forces in motion that no mortal oath could contain. When Paris arrived in Sparta as a guest, Aphrodite's promise began to unfold. Whether Helen fell genuinely in love with the handsome Trojan prince, or whether she was enchanted by the goddess's irresistible power, or whether she was simply desperate to escape a life that had never truly belonged to her, we cannot say. The ancient sources disagree, and perhaps that disagreement is itself part of the story's enduring power. What we know is this: Helen left Sparta with Paris, abandoning her husband, her daughter, and her position as queen. Some versions say she went willingly, swept away by a passion stronger than duty or honor. Others claim she was abducted, stolen away like a treasure from a temple. Still others suggest she was spirited away by the gods themselves, leaving only a phantom in her place, while her true self waited out the war in Egypt. But regardless of how she left, her departure triggered the oath that Odysseus had so cleverly devised. The former suitors were bound by sacred vows to help Menelaus retrieve his wife. Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, and the most powerful king in Greece, assembled the greatest military expedition the world had ever seen. 1,000 ships, black-hulled, and bronze-beaked, filled with warriors whose names would echo through eternity. Achilles the invincible, Ajax the tower of strength, Odysseus the cunning, Nestor the wise counselor. All of this, the poets tell us, for the love of one woman. Yet as we consider Helen's story in the quiet of this night, we might ask ourselves whether the poets were telling the whole truth. Was the Trojan War really fought for Helen's beauty? Or was Helen simply a convenient excuse for conflicts that had deeper roots? Ancient Troy controlled the vital strait between Europe and Asia, taxing the profitable trade routes that connected the Greek world with the riches of the East. Perhaps the Greek kings had economic and strategic reasons for wanting to conquer Troy, and Helen's abduction merely provided them with a cause that would inspire their warriors and justify their ambitions. This possibility makes Helen's position even more tragic. If the war was truly about her, then she bears the terrible weight of responsibility for 10 years of slaughter. But if the war would have happened anyway, then she becomes something even sadder, a scapegoat, a woman blamed for conflicts she neither started nor could control. Homer, with his genius for psychological insight, seems to understand both possibilities. In the Iliad, he shows us Helen as neither pure victim nor femme fatale, but as something more complex, a woman fully aware of the destruction that surrounds her name, yet powerless to stop it. When she appears on Troy's walls to watch the fighting, below, the Trojan elders admit that, yes, she is worth fighting for, but perhaps not worth dying for. Even they, who see her daily, struggle to balance her undeniable beauty against the price it demands. In one of the most poignant scenes in all literature, Homer shows us Helen weaving a tapestry that depicts the very war being fought over her. She sits in her chamber in Troy, her fingers working the loom, creating an artwork that mirrors the destruction unfolding outside her window. It is a moment of profound meta-literary brilliance. Helen, the subject of the story, creating her own version of the story, trapped within narratives that she can observe but cannot escape. This image of Helen at her loom has haunted artists and writers for millennia because it captures something essential about the feminine experience in a world shaped by masculine conflict. Helen possesses the beauty that men claim to value above all else, yet that same beauty becomes a prison. She is simultaneously the most desired and the most blamed woman in literature, celebrated and vilified often in the same breath. Different cultures have seen different Helens. The medieval troubadours transformed her into an ideal of courtly love, pure and inspiring. Renaissance writers explored her as a symbol of artistic inspiration, beauty so perfect it demanded creation even at the cost of destruction. Romantic poets cast her as a figure of tragic inevitability, caught in forces beyond mortal control. Modern feminists have reclaimed her as a woman struggling for agency in a world that sees her only as object, never as subject, perhaps the most profound question Helen raises is this: what is the relationship between beauty and responsibility? If you possess something that others desire intensely, are you responsible for their actions in pursuing it? If your very existence inspires both worship and warfare, what do you owe to those who suffer in your name? Helen herself seems to wrestle with these questions throughout the Iliad. She calls herself a shameless whore and an evil-minded wretch, yet she cannot undo what has been done. She expresses regret for the suffering caused by her beauty, yet she cannot make herself ugly. She is, in many ways, the first character in Western literature to embody the modern concept of celebrity, famous for being famous, powerful because of others' projections onto her, trapped within an identity she never chose. As you rest now in the darkness, consider how Helen's dilemma echoes through our own time. We live in an age obsessed with beauty, where images of perfect faces and forms are transmitted instantly across the globe, where appearance can launch careers and destroy lives, where the gap between public persona and private reality grows ever wider. Helen's story reminds us that beauty, while genuinely valuable, can become its own form of bondage. When the war finally ended and Troy fell, different traditions offer different fates for Helen. Some say she returned to Sparta with Menelaus, forgiven and restored to her position as queen. Others claim she was executed by the Greek women whose sons had died for her sake. Still others tell of her ascending to become a goddess herself, finally escaping the mortal realm where beauty and suffering are so mysteriously intertwined. But perhaps the truest ending for Helen is that she never really ended at all. She lives on in every story about the price of beauty, every tale of love that reshapes the world, every exploration of how individual choices ripple outward to affect countless other lives. She exists in the tension between desire and consequence, between the celebration of beauty and the recognition of its costs. Tonight, as sleep begins to claim you, you might picture Helen not as she appears in any particular telling of her story, but as she exists in the space between all tellings, a figure of eternal mystery, neither wholly innocent nor wholly guilty, but eternally human in her struggle to understand her place in a story much larger than herself. The face that launched 1,000 ships sails on, through dreams and memories, carrying questions that have no easy answers, embodying paradoxes that define the human condition itself. In the flickering light of ancient campfires, when the day's fighting was done, and the warriors gathered to tend their wounds and share their wine, they would tell stories of the men who had distinguished themselves in battle. These were not tales of faceless armies clashing like waves against rock, but intimate portraits of individual souls tested by the crucible of war. Tonight, as we walk among the shadows of heroes both Greek and Trojan, let us meet the men whose names have echoed across 3 millennia, each carrying within himself the full complexity of human nature. Let us begin with Achilles, for in many ways all other heroes are measured against him. Son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, Achilles embodies the central paradox of heroism. He is simultaneously the most glorious and the most destructive figure in Homer's epic. As an infant, his mother dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, holding him by the heel, which remained his only mortal weakness. But his true vulnerability was not physical, but psychological, a pride so fierce it could reshape the course of history. Achilles knew his fate. His mother had told him he could choose between 2 destinies, a long, peaceful life of obscurity or a short life crowned with eternal glory. He chose glory, but Homer shows us the terrible price of that choice. When Agamemnon dishonors him by taking away his prize, the captive woman Briseis, Achilles withdraws from battle, sulking in his tent while his fellow Greeks die without his protection. This is what makes Achilles so fascinating and so disturbing. He possesses godlike power and uses it like a petulant child. His rage is magnificent and terrible, pure emotion, untempered by political calculation or social responsibility. He would rather watch his own people perish than swallow his wounded pride. And yet, when his beloved companion Patroclus is killed wearing Achilles' own armor, we see another side of the hero. Grief so profound it transforms rage into something. Approaching wisdom in his final confrontation with Hector, Achilles has moved beyond personal honor to something deeper. He fights not for glory, but for love, not to win prizes, but to avenge the death of the one person who understood him completely. After he kills Hector, he drags the body around Troy's walls in a display of savage grief that horrifies even the gods. Yet in the epic's most moving scene, when Hector's father Priam comes to ransom his son's body, Achilles finds compassion, seeing in the old king's tears a reflection of his own father's grief. Across the battlefield, Hector presents a very different model of heroism, where Achilles is driven by personal honor and emotional extremes. Hector embodies duty, responsibility, and the weight of defending everything he holds dear. He is Troy's greatest defender, the pillar upon which the city's survival depends. Yet Homer never lets us forget that he is also a husband and father. The scene of Hector's farewell to his wife, Andromache, and infant son Astyanax, may be the most human moment in all epic literature. As Hector prepares to face Achilles, knowing he will likely die, Andromache begs him to stay within the walls, to think of her and their child. But Hector cannot abandon his duty, even though he foresees with heartbreaking clarity what will happen to his family when Troy falls. His honor demands that he fight, even unto death, for the simple reason that he is Hector, and this is what Hector must do. Yet Homer shows us Hector's fear as well as his courage. When Achilles finally comes for him, Hector runs 3 times around Troy's walls he flees, until the gods deceive him into making his final stand. His terror makes his ultimate courage more, not less, heroic. He dies knowing that his death means Troy's doom, yet he faces Achilles anyway, asking only that his body be returned to his parents for proper burial. Between these 2 great warriors moves a figure who embodies a different kind of heroism altogether. Odysseus, whose weapon is not the sword, but the mind. Later traditions would make him the hero of his own epic, but in the Iliad, he appears as the Greeks' most valuable problem solver, the man they turn to when strength alone is insufficient. Odysseus represents the emergence of a new kind of hero, one who survives not through divine favor or superhuman strength, but through intelligence, adaptability, and an almost modern understanding of human psychology. He sees through deceptions, crafts strategies, and somehow manages to be both completely loyal to the Greek cause and utterly pragmatic about the methods required to achieve victory. It is Odysseus who will conceive the wooden horse, the stratagem, that finally breaks Troy's walls. Yet even Odysseus pays a price for his cleverness. His journey home will take 10 years of wandering, during which he will lose all his men and endure sufferings that match any purely physical ordeal. Homer seems to suggest that intelligence, like strength, exacts its own toll on those who wield it. On the Greek side, we also encounter Ajax, son of Telamon, a hero of such straightforward courage and reliability that he becomes almost mythic in his steadiness. Where Achilles is mercurial and Odysseus complex, Ajax is bedrock solid, the warrior his comrades know they can depend on absolutely. His tragedy lies in being overshadowed by more glamorous heroes. Yet Homer shows us that without men like Ajax, no army could survive. Agamemnon, king of kings and leader of the Greek expedition, presents us with perhaps the most realistic portrait of leadership in crisis. He is neither purely heroic nor purely villainous, but a man struggling with responsibilities that would crush most mortals. His quarrel with Achilles over Briseis reveals both his weakness for pride and his understanding that maintaining authority sometimes requires actions that undermine the very cause one seeks to serve. Among the Trojans, Paris presents the most complex case. The man whose actions triggered the entire war is perhaps the least warlike of all the major characters. Handsome, charming, skilled in music and poetry, Paris represents the aesthetic and erotic forces that both inspire and threaten civilization. His brother Hector despises his weakness in battle, yet it was Paris's sensitivity to beauty that brought Helen to Troy and gave the city its most precious treasure. King Priam of Troy embodies the tragedy of age and wisdom coming too late to prevent disaster. He sees clearly the costs of the war his son has triggered, yet his paternal love prevents him from simply returning Helen to end the conflict. In his midnight journey to Achilles' tent to ransom Hector's body, Priam displays a courage different from any warrior's, the courage of a father's love, overcoming a king's pride. What makes Homer's characterizations so enduring is their psychological complexity. These are not cardboard heroes and villains, but recognizable human beings caught in impossible circumstances. Each embodies virtues that become destructive when taken to extremes. Achilles' courage becomes reckless pride. Hector's duty becomes inflexible honor. Odysseus's intelligence becomes manipulative cunning. As you settle deeper into sleep tonight, consider how these ancient warriors continue to live within us. We all know Achilles' rage when our deepest values are challenged. We all understand Hector's conflict between personal desire and public responsibility. We recognize Odysseus's temptation to solve problems through cleverness rather than confrontation. We have felt Priam's helpless love watching our children make choices we cannot prevent. These heroes speak to us across the centuries because they embody the eternal tensions of human existence. They show us what we might become at our best and worst, what we aspire to and what we fear in ourselves. They remind us that heroism is not the absence of fear or doubt or moral complexity, but the willingness to act meaningfully despite these all-too-human limitations. In dreams, we might meet them walking the plain before Troy, their bronze armor catching the last light of day. Achilles striding in solitary magnificence, terrible in his beauty and power. Hector pausing to look back at the walls of Troy, seeing his wife's figure on the ramparts. Odysseus studying the enemy lines, his mind already 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Ajax standing solid as a mountain, shield up, sword ready. Paris tuning his lyre while arrows fall around him. Priam weeping for sons who will not come home. They are all here, waiting in the space between history and imagination, ready to teach us again what it means to be human when everything we love is at stake. Tomorrow, we will explore the city they fought for and against, the walls that witnessed their glory and their doom. But tonight, they live in the timeless realm of story, where heroism and tragedy dance together under stars that remember when the world was young and every choice carried. The weight of destiny. The heroes await your dreams, bearing the eternal questions that make mortals reach towards something immortal. If you were to stand on the plains of Troy in the early morning light, when the mist rises from the Scamander River and the air still holds the coolness of night, you would see before you one of humanity's most enduring symbols. Walls, not just any walls, but ramparts built to last forever, constructed with such skill and ambition that even their ruins command respect 3,000 years after their builders turned to dust. Let us walk together up the gentle slope toward the citadel, feeling beneath our feet the worn stones that have supported countless generations of pilgrims, merchants, warriors, and dreamers. As we climb, notice how the walls grow higher and more massive, each course of stones fitted with precision that speaks of master craftsmen who took pride in work that would outlive them by millennia. These are not merely defensive barriers, but statements of intent, declarations carved in stone that here lived a people who understood permanence, who built not for decades, but for eternity. The lower courses consist of massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together so perfectly that even today you cannot slide a knife blade between them. Above these foundations rise walls of smaller, more carefully dressed stones, creating a defensive system that soars 40 feet into the sky. As we approach the great gate, pause for a moment to consider what this entrance meant to those who built it. In the Bronze Age world, a city's gates were far more than practical necessities. They were sacred thresholds, places where the civilized world met the wild, where friends were welcomed and enemies were held at bay. The gates of Troy were legendary, even in antiquity. Massive portals of bronze-reinforced timber that could withstand the assault of armies while opening wide enough for merchant caravans and royal processions. Homer tells us that these gates were crafted by the gods themselves, and as we examine the remains, we can understand why ancient peoples might have attributed divine workmanship to such imposing constructions. The gateway is not a simple opening, but a sophisticated defensive system designed to channel attackers into killing grounds where defenders on the walls above could rain down spears and stones with devastating effect. But step through this portal, and you discover that Troy was far more than a military fortress. Within these protective walls lay a thriving city, a cosmopolitan center where cultures from Europe, Asia, and Africa met and mingled. The archaeological evidence reveals broad streets paved with stone, sophisticated drainage systems, workshops, where artisans created goods that were traded from Britain to Babylon, and palaces decorated with frescoes that rivaled anything in the Mycenaean world. Picture the daily life within these walls during Troy's golden age. In the lower city, which sprawled beyond the citadel proper, merchants would have haggled over prices in a dozen languages. The harbor, now silted over, but once deep enough for the largest ships, would have bustled with vessels carrying tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, silk from China, gold from Nubia. Troy's location at the entrance to the Black Sea made it a natural checkpoint for trade between Europe and Asia, and the city grew wealthy by controlling this vital commercial artery. The upper citadel housed the royal family and the most important temples. Here, in palaces whose foundations we can still trace, lived the kings who claimed descent from the gods, who wore crowns of gold and carried scepters of ivory and precious metals. Their wives wore jewelry that archaeologists have found scattered through the ruins, diadems of gold leaves, necklaces of carnelian and lapis lazuli, rings bearing seals that once authorized treaties and trade agreements. Yet it is the walls themselves that capture the imagination most completely, not just because of their size and strength, but because of what they represented to the people who lived within their protection. In a world where might truly made right, where armies could appear without warning to destroy everything a people had built over generations, walls meant the difference between civilization and chaos, between continuity and catastrophe. Homer understood this psychological dimension of Troy's defenses. Throughout the Iliad, the walls serve as more than military obstacles. They are symbols of Troy's identity, markers of the boundary between the known and the unknown, the domestic and the foreign. When Hector fights on the walls, he is not just defending stone and mortar, but protecting a way of life, a collection of relationships and traditions that give meaning to human existence. The most poignant scenes in Comneg, Homer's epic, take place on these walls. Here Helen stands with Priam, pointing out the Greek heroes and feeling the weight of being both Troy's greatest treasure and its greatest liability. Here Andromache watches her husband Hector prepare for battle, knowing that the walls, which have protected Troy for so long, may not be strong enough to shield the man she loves. From an archaeological perspective, the walls of Troy tell a story of continuous occupation and reconstruction spanning over 3,000 years. The earliest inhabitants built simple stone foundations. Each succeeding generation improved and expanded these defenses, responding to new military technologies and growing threats. By the late Bronze Age, when the legendary war is supposed to have taken place, Troy possessed one of the most sophisticated defensive systems in the ancient world. But these walls witnessed more than warfare. They protected the rise of one of humanity's earliest experiments in urban living, the development of complex trade networks, the flowering of arts and crafts that influenced cultures from Ireland to India. Within Troy's embrace, metallurgists perfected techniques for working bronze that spread throughout Europe. Potters created vessels of such beauty that they were treasured in palaces from Mycenae to Memphis. Textile workers developed weaving patterns that influenced fashion for centuries. The walls also protected something less tangible but equally important: the development of diplomatic traditions that helped stabilize the volatile politics of the late Bronze Age. Troy's location made it a natural meeting place for representatives of different cultures, and the city became a center for the exchange of ideas as well as goods. Marriage alliances were negotiated here, treaties were signed, and ambassadors learned the delicate art of peaceful coexistence in a world that seemed always on the edge of war. As we walk along the ramparts in our imagination, feeling the massive stones warm from the day's sun, we might consider how these walls functioned as more than barriers. They were stages upon which the drama of human civilization played out, platforms from which defenders could see approaching friends or enemies while remaining visible themselves to those they protected. The tragedy of Troy's walls is not just that they eventually fell, but that their very strength may have contributed to the city's destruction. Their fame attracted enemies who saw conquering Troy as the ultimate test of military prowess. Their wealth, accumulated through centuries of prosperous trade, made the city an irresistible target. Their reputation for impregnability challenged the pride of would-be conquerors who could not rest until they had proven that no human construction could stand against determined assault. Yet in another sense, Troy's walls never truly fell. They live on in every human attempt to create safe spaces in a dangerous world, every effort to build something that will outlast the builders, every hope that strong foundations and careful craftsmanship can protect what we hold most dear. They persist in our architectural traditions, in the symbolic language we use to describe psychological and spiritual defenses, in our persistent belief that some things are worth defending regardless of the cost. As you settle deeper into sleep tonight, you might imagine yourself standing on those ancient ramparts, looking out over the plain where heroes once fought and died. Feel the solid stone beneath your feet, stone placed there by hands that have been dust for 3 millennia, yet whose work continues to inspire wonder and respect. The walls of Troy were built to be eternal, and in the most important sense, they have succeeded. They endure not in limestone and mortar, but in human memory, not as archaeological remains, but as symbols of our endless struggle to create order in chaos, beauty in brutality, permanence in a world of constant change. Tomorrow, we will explore the mystery of the wooden horse, the stratagem that finally breached these mighty walls. But tonight, rest safely within walls of your own making, in the sanctuary of sleep where the best human dreams take refuge from the storms of waking life. The walls stand guard over your dreams, as they have stood guard over human hopes for 3,000 years of nights. The moon hangs low over the Trojan plain tonight, casting long shadows across the battlefield that has known so much sorrow. For 10 long years, the Greeks have camped outside these mighty walls, their ships drawn up on the shore like sleeping sea creatures. Tonight, we turn our attention to perhaps the most famous deception in all of human storytelling, the great wooden horse that would seal Troy's fate. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to that ancient shore where the sound of waves mingles with whispered plans and desperate hope. The war has dragged on far longer than anyone imagined when those 1,000 ships first appeared on the horizon. Heroes have fallen, dreams have crumbled to dust, and both sides have paid a price that seems too heavy for any mortal conflict, too. Bear got it was Odysseus, that master of cunning thoughts, who first conceived the plan that would end this endless siege. Picture him in his tent, oil lamps flickering as he traces patterns in the sand, his clever mind working like the gears of some divine machine. The walls of Troy had proven unbreakable through force of arms. Achilles' rage, Hector's courage, Ajax's strength, none of these had been enough to bring down those towering ramparts that Poseidon himself had helped to build. But perhaps, Odysseus reasoned, what could not be taken by storm might be won by guile. In the darkness of his tent, surrounded by maps and half-finished battle plans, he envisioned something unprecedented, a gift that would be Troy's destruction, wrapped in the guise of tribute to the gods. The next morning brought unusual activity to the Greek camp. Craftsmen who had spent years forging weapons and repairing ships now turned their skills to a different purpose. Under Odysseus's direction, they began to construct something the world had never seen, a horse of such immense proportions that it seemed to dwarf the very ships that had carried them across the wine-dark sea. Day by day, the great beast took shape. Its frame was built from the strongest timbers, oak from sacred groves, pine from mountain slopes, where eagles nested, cedar that held the memory of ancient forests. The Greeks worked with a kind of reverent concentration, knowing that their lives and the fate of their long campaign rested on this single, audacious gambit. The horse stood 30 feet high when completed, its wooden flanks gleaming with oil and care, its neck arched proudly, carved with such skill that it seemed almost alive in the shifting light. The anonymous craftsmen who shaped its features had poured all their homesickness and battle weariness into their work, creating something that was both terrible and beautiful, a monument to human ingenuity and the lengths to which desperate people will go. But this was no mere sculpture. Hidden within the horse's belly, accessible through a carefully concealed door, was a hollow chamber large enough to hold 30 of Greece's finest warriors. Here, in cramped darkness, the bravest men of the expedition would wait through the longest night of their lives, gambling everything on Odysseus's faith in Trojan curiosity and pride. The plan required perfect timing and nerves of steel. The Greek fleet would sail away under cover of darkness, disappearing beyond the horizon as if abandoning their long siege in defeat. Only the horse would remain, standing silent and mysterious on the empty beach like some divine visitation. And hidden nearby, on the island of Tenedos just out of sight, the ships would wait for the signal that would bring them, racing back to claim their prize, On the night before the deception was to begin, the chosen warriors gathered around their strange wooden vessel. These were men who had faced death in 100 battles, who had seen friends fall and enemies triumph, who carried scars from spear points and sword edges like badges of their long service. Yet tonight, as they prepared to climb into that dark interior, even the bravest among them felt the chill of uncertainty. Imagine Menelaus, Helen's husband, whose personal grief had started this entire war, running his weathered hands along the horse's flank and wondering if he would live to see his wife again. Picture Neoptolemus, Achilles' young son, trying to live up to his father's legendary courage while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. And Odysseus himself, the architect of this desperate plan, must have felt the weight of all their lives pressing down on him as he made his final inspections. Every joint had to be secure, every hiding place perfectly concealed, every detail calculated to deceive eyes that would be searching for any sign of Greek treachery. As dawn approached, the warriors took their positions within the horse's belly. The space was cramped and airless, forcing grown men to huddle together like children hiding from a storm. They carried only essential weapons, daggers and short swords that could be wielded in close quarters. Everything else, their pride, their comfort, their very lives, they entrusted to the strength of timber and the wisdom of their leader's plan. The signal was given, and the Greek army began its elaborate charade of departure. Tents were struck, supplies loaded aboard the ships, and the great vessels pushed out into the retreating tide. To watching Trojan sentries on the high walls, it must have seemed like the end of a terrible chapter. The invaders, finally admitting defeat and sailing home to their distant shores. But as the last ship disappeared beyond the headland, one thing remained on the deserted beach. The horse stood in solitary majesty, its wooden form catching the first rays of the morning sun. No explanation accompanied it, no message or demand. It simply waited, as enigmatic as a riddle posed by the gods themselves. Inside their wooden prison, the hidden warriors began the longest day of their lives. Hour after hour passed in stifling darkness, each man fighting his own private battle against fear and doubt. They could hear nothing of the outside world, no voices, no movement, no sign of whether their ruse was succeeding or failing. Time seemed to stretch like heated bronze, each moment an eternity of uncertainty. Meanwhile, on Troy's walls, the greatest debate in the city's history had begun. King Priam and his counselors gazed down at the mysterious gift, arguing its meaning with the passion of men whose very survival hung in the balance. Some saw divine favor, a peace offering from defeated enemies who sought the gods' blessing for their homeward journey. Others suspected treachery, warning that Greeks bearing gifts were never to be trusted. The priest Laocoon stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for the gods themselves. He warned against accepting the horse, speaking words that would echo through history. "I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts." To prove his point, he hurled a spear at the horse's flank, and the hollow sound that echoed from within should have been warning enough. But the fates had already decided Troy's destiny. A great serpent emerged from the sea, whether sent by divine will or merely a creature of the deep responding to some ancient call, we cannot say. It seized Laocoon and his 2 sons, crushing the life from them before the horrified eyes of all. Troy, to the watching Trojans, this seemed clear proof that the gods favored accepting the wooden horse. The debate was over. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the Trojans began the monumental task of bringing the horse within their walls. They worked with ropes and levers, with prayers and songs, gradually coaxing the massive structure through gates that had to be widened to accommodate its bulk. Every citizen of Troy turned out to help, from the mightiest warrior to the smallest child, all united in what they believed was a celebration of their victory. As night fell over Troy, the city erupted in celebration. Wine flowed like water. Songs rose to the starlit sky, and for the first time in 10 years, the gates were thrown wide in welcome rather than barred against siege. Men and women danced in the streets, children played games of war with wooden swords, and even the animals seemed to sense the change in their master's mood. Within the wooden horse, the hidden warriors waited with the patience of hunters. They could hear the celebration raging around them, voices raised in joy, the stamp of dancing feet, the sound of cups striking in toast after toast. Each laugh and cheer was a dagger to their hearts, for they knew the terrible price this joy would. Soon demand. Midnight came and went. Gradually, the sounds of celebration died away as exhausted Trojans sought their beds. The city that had stood vigilant for a decade finally allowed itself to sleep deeply, secure behind walls that had never been breached, protected by a gift they believed the gods themselves had provided. It was then, in the deepest hour of night, that Odysseus gave the signal. One by one, the hidden warriors dropped silently from the horse's belly, their feet touching Trojan soil for the first time. They moved like shadows through the sleeping city, past guards who dreamed of peace, past altars where incense still smoldered from evening prayers. Their mission was simple but terrible. While Troy slept, they would open the gates to let in the Greek army, which had already returned under cover of darkness. The ships had sailed back as soon as the sun set, guided by signal fires that the hidden warriors would light from within the city itself. And so the great wooden horse, that masterpiece of deception and desperate ingenuity, fulfilled its dark purpose. What had seemed like a symbol of Trojan victory became the instrument of the city's destruction. The horse stands in our memories not just as a clever stratagem, but as a reminder of how thin the line can be between triumph and tragedy, between the gifts we welcome and the doom we invite into our lives. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember this ancient truth. The most dangerous enemies often come disguised as friends, and the greatest victories sometimes contain the seeds of our greatest defeats. The wooden horse of Troy reminds us that in a world of shifting loyalties and hidden motives, wisdom lies not in trusting appearances, but in questioning even the gifts that seem most generous. Rest now, and let the image of that great wooden form fade into the comfortable darkness of your dreams, where ancient stories blend with peaceful slumber, and the lessons of the past whisper softly of the eternal human drama that continues still. The gentle evening breeze carries us now from the realm of ancient myth to the patient world of archaeological discovery. Here, beneath layers of earth and time, the truth about Troy lies waiting, not in the grand pronouncements of epic poetry, but in the quiet testimony of broken pottery, charred timbers, and stones worn smooth by countless hands. Let yourself settle comfortably as we journey to the 19th century, to a time when the boundary between legend and history was about to be redrawn forever. Picture the rolling hills of northwestern Turkey, where shepherds grazed their flocks among mounds that rose mysteriously from the landscape like sleeping giants. Few suspected that beneath these gentle slopes lay the remains of one of history's most famous cities. It was here that Heinrich Schliemann would make his extraordinary gamble, a businessman turned archaeologist who dared to believe that Homer's epic poems were more than mere fiction. Schliemann was a man of remarkable contradictions. Wealthy yet restless, practical yet driven by romantic dreams, methodical in business yet impulsive in his pursuit of ancient glory. Born in Germany in 1822, Schliemann had spent his youth listening to his father read aloud from Homer's Iliad. Even as a boy, he was captivated by the stories of brave Hector and swift-footed Achilles, of Helen's beauty and Paris's folly. But unlike other children who outgrew such tales, Schliemann carried them into adulthood like precious treasures, never quite accepting that they were merely the products of poetic imagination. By the time he reached middle age, Schliemann had accumulated considerable wealth through various business ventures. He had learned languages with the same determination he brought to commerce, mastering Russian, Greek, Arabic, and more than a dozen others. Yet despite his worldly success, the stories of Troy continued to haunt his dreams. The businessman, who could calculate profits and negotiate contracts, found himself increasingly drawn to an ancient mystery that had no guaranteed return on investment. In 1868, Schliemann made a decision that would change archaeology forever. He would find Troy, not the Troy of scholars' debates or poets' fancies, but the actual city where real people had lived and loved and died. Armed with his copy of Homer and an unshakable faith in the historical accuracy of the Iliad, he set out for the coast of Asia Minor. The site he chose was a hill called Hisarlik, rising from the plains near the entrance to the Dardanelles. Local tradition had long associated this mound with ancient Troy, and Schliemann found the location perfectly matched Homer's geographical descriptions. The hill commanded views of both sea and plain, positioned exactly where the poet had placed his legendary city. But when Schliemann began his excavations in 1870, what he found was far more complex than he had anticipated. Instead of a single city, the hill revealed layer upon layer of ancient settlements, each built upon the ruins of its predecessor, like chapters in an enormous book written in stone and pottery. Picture Schliemann on those early morning digs, the Turkish sun just beginning to warm the excavation site. His workers moved carefully through the accumulated debris of centuries, their shovels and brushes revealing fragments of a dozen different civilizations. Each layer told its own story, some ending in fire and destruction, others abandoned gradually. As people sought their fortunes elsewhere, Schliemann identified 9 distinct layers, which he numbered from bottom to top. Troy the first, the deepest and oldest, dated back to around 3000 BCE, a small settlement of the early Bronze Age. Troy II, which Schliemann initially believed was Homer's Troy, showed evidence of greater wealth and sophistication, with impressive fortifications. And what appeared to be a royal treasure. It was in Troy II that Schliemann made his most spectacular discovery. On a May morning in 1873, he spotted the glint of gold among the stones. Working feverishly with his wife Sophia, he uncovered a collection of golden jewelry, silver vessels, and bronze weapons of extraordinary craftsmanship. Convinced he had found the treasure of King Priam himself, Schliemann smuggled the artifacts out of Turkey and displayed them to a wondering world as proof that Troy was real. The discovery created a sensation. Here was tangible evidence that the world of Homer was not pure fantasy, but rooted in historical reality. Museums competed to display the treasures, scholars debated their significance, and the public marveled at these golden links to their cultural past. Schliemann had achieved what he set out to do. He had put Troy back on the map, literally and figuratively. Yet even as the world celebrated, more careful analysis began to reveal problems with Schliemann's initial conclusions. The treasure he had found was magnificent, but it dated to around 2500 BCE, more than 1,000 years too early to be connected with the Trojan War of Greek legend. Troy II had been destroyed by fire, but its inhabitants lived in a world that knew nothing of the Greek heroes who would later make the city famous. As excavations continued under Schliemann and later archaeologists, a more nuanced picture began to emerge. Troy Vey, which had flourished from about 1700 to 1250 BCE, showed clear signs of Greek influence and contact with the Mycenaean civilization that Homer described. Its massive walls and sophisticated architecture suggested a city wealthy and powerful enough to attract the kind of coalition army that Greek legend described. But it was Troy V, IIA, the next layer up, that provided the most tantalizing evidence for a historical Trojan War. This city showed clear signs of siege and violent destruction around. 1180 BCE, precisely the time period when ancient sources placed the legendary conflict. Arrowheads were found embedded in the walls. Storage jars were packed into every available space, as if the inhabitants were preparing for a long siege. And the final destruction layer showed the unmistakable evidence of fire and conquest. Picture those ancient defenders in their final desperate months, cramming supplies into basement storerooms and reinforcing walls that their ancestors had built centuries before. Archaeological evidence suggests they were under tremendous pressure. Repairs to fortifications were hasty and makeshift. Living spaces were converted to storage areas, and the general layout of the city showed all the signs of a community under siege. The pottery found in Troy Via tells its own story of cultural contact and conflict. Greek vessels sit alongside local Anatolian wares, suggesting the kind of international involvement that the Iliad describes. Trade goods from across the eastern Mediterranean indicate that this was indeed a wealthy city worth fighting over, a strategic location that controlled access to the lucrative trade routes leading into the Black Sea. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed even more sophisticated details about daily life in ancient Troy. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped the complete layout of the city without disturbing the remaining ruins. Computer analysis of pottery styles has traced the evolution of Trojan culture across centuries. DNA analysis of human remains has provided insights into the ethnic composition of the population. What emerges from all this careful scientific work is a picture far more complex than either Homer's epic or Schliemann's romantic vision. Troy was not a single city, but a succession of settlements, each adapting to changing times and circumstances. The Trojan War, if it occurred, was probably not the grand romantic conflict of legend, but rather a more typical Bronze Age dispute over trade routes and territorial control. Yet this archaeological reality does not diminish Troy's significance. Instead, it adds layers of meaning to the ancient stories. The Troy that archaeologists have uncovered was a real place where real people faced the same fundamental challenges that humans have always confronted: how to build lasting communities, how to deal with conflict and change, how to create meaning. In the face of mortality, the stones that Schliemann first uncovered still lie exposed to the Turkish sun, testament to his passionate belief that the past could be recovered through patient investigation. His methods may have been crude by modern standards, and his interpretations often colored by romantic preconceptions. Yet his fundamental insight was correct. The world of Homer was not pure imagination, but had roots in historical reality. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider the patient work of archaeology, the careful brushing away of earth, the meticulous recording of finds, the slow accumulation of evidence that gradually illuminates the past. Like sleep itself, archaeological discovery happens slowly, layer by layer, revealing truths that were always there, but hidden beneath the surface of everyday awareness. The real Troy may not have been exactly as Homer described it, but it was. No less remarkable for being human in scale and historical in nature. In the end, perhaps that makes the story even more powerful, the knowledge that ordinary people once walked these ancient streets, faced extraordinary challenges, and left behind traces that still speak to us across more than 3,000 years of silence. The evening shadows deepen as we move now from the archaeologist's careful excavations to the broader canvas of history itself. Here, in the quiet space between myth and documented fact, we must ask the question that has intrigued scholars for generations. Did the Trojan War actually happen? And if it did, what can we understand about the real conflict that inspired one of humanity's greatest stories? Rest your mind as we journey back to the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, when the Eastern Mediterranean was a crossroads of civilizations. Picture a world very different from our own, yet familiar in its fundamental human concerns. Great palace kingdoms dominated the landscape: the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in central Anatolia, the Egyptians along the Nile, and smaller but prosperous city-states scattered along the coasts and islands of the Aegean Sea. This was a world built on trade and diplomacy, where copper from Cyprus mixed with tin from distant lands to create the bronze that gave the age its name. Ships heavy with grain, wine, olive oil, and precious goods moved constantly across the blue waters, following routes that had been established for centuries. And at one of the most strategic points along these trade routes sat a city that controlled access to the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that led to the rich lands around the Black Sea. The city we know as Troy occupied a position of extraordinary commercial importance. Any merchant seeking to reach the profitable markets of the north had to pass within sight of its walls. The prevailing winds and currents often forced ships to wait for favorable conditions, creating opportunities for the Trojans to provide supplies, collect tribute, or simply demonstrate their power to those who had passed through their domain. Archaeological evidence suggests that Troy Viia, the layer most likely associated with the legendary war, was indeed a wealthy and sophisticated city. Its inhabitants lived in comfortable houses, possessed fine pottery and metalwork, and maintained extensive trade connections throughout the known world. This was not a primitive settlement, but a thriving urban center that had grown prosperous from its strategic location and the business acumen of its rulers. But prosperity in the Bronze Age world was always precarious. The delicate balance of power that maintained peace and trade could shift suddenly when harvests failed, when ambitious rulers sought to expand their territories, or when new technologies gave military advantages to one group over another. The late 13th century BCE was a time of particular instability, marked by the mysterious collapse of several major civilizations and the movement of displaced peoples throughout the eastern Mediterranean. It was during this turbulent period, around 1180 BCE, that Troy Viia met its violent end. The archaeological evidence is unmistakable. The city was destroyed by fire, its walls breached, its buildings burned, and its inhabitants either killed or scattered. Arrowheads embedded in the fortifications speak of a siege, while the hasty repairs and emergency storage preparations visible in the ruins suggest a city under sustained military pressure. This destruction fits remarkably well with the time frame that ancient sources assign to the Trojan War. Greek chronographers, working centuries later, placed the fall of Troy around 1184 BCE, within a few years of what the archaeological evidence suggests. While this correlation does not prove that Agamemnon and Achilles were historical figures, it does suggest that some significant military conflict occurred at Troy during the period when Greek tradition said it did. The question then becomes, what might this historical conflict have looked like? Certainly not the grand romantic war of Homer's imagination, with its single combats between heroes and direct intervention by the gods. The real Trojan War, if it occurred, would have been smaller in scale, but no less devastating for those who experienced it. Picture instead a more typical Bronze Age conflict, perhaps a coalition of Mycenaean Greek chieftains, motivated by economic opportunity rather than romantic passion, decided to challenge Trojan control over the lucrative trade routes through the Dardanelles. Such coalitions were not uncommon in the ancient world, where successful raids could bring tremendous wealth and prestige to their leaders. The attackers might have numbered in the hundreds rather than the tens of thousands Homer describes, but they would have been formidable warriors nonetheless. Mycenaean Greeks were skilled in Bronze Age warfare, with bronze weapons and armor, horse-drawn chariots, and sophisticated siege techniques. They had already demonstrated their military prowess by conquering Minoan Crete and establishing trading posts throughout the Mediterranean. The siege itself might have lasted months rather than years, but it would have been no less desperate for its shorter duration. Archaeological evidence from Troy v. Aea suggests that the final phase of the city's existence was marked by increasing desperation storage areas packed with supplies, living spaces converted to defensive purposes, and repairs to fortifications, done with whatever materials were at hand. The end, when it came, would have been swift and brutal. Bronze Age sieges typically culminated in a sudden breakthrough, followed by the sacking and burning of the defeated city. The victors would have carried off whatever portable wealth they could find, enslaved the surviving population, and left the city in ruins as a warning to others who might challenge their power. This reconstruction, based on archaeological evidence, and our understanding of Bronze Age warfare, lacks the romantic grandeur of Homer's epic. There is no Helen whose beauty launched 1,000 ships, no Achilles whose rage shook the foundations of the world, no divine intervention to tip the scales of battle. Instead, we have the more prosaic but no less human story of economic competition, military ambition, and the terrible cost that ordinary people pay when their leaders choose the path of war. Yet even this more modest version of events helps explain why the Trojan War captured the Greek imagination so powerfully. The destruction of such a wealthy and strategically important city would have been a significant event in the Bronze Age world, talked about and remembered long after the last flames had died down. Over the generations, as the story was retold, around hearth fires and in royal halls, it gradually accumulated the mythological elements that transformed it from historical event to timeless epic. The collapse of Troy v. Aea was part of a broader pattern of destruction that swept across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Within a few decades, the Mycenaean palaces in Greece were abandoned, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia collapsed, and cities throughout the region showed evidence of attack and abandonment. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, and its causes remain one of archaeology's great mysteries. Some scholars point to invasions by mysterious sea peoples, maritime raiders whose attacks disrupted trade networks and destabilized established governments. Others suggest that climate change led to crop failures and famine, triggering mass migrations and conflicts over increasingly scarce resources. Still others propose that internal rebellions or the breakdown of established diplomatic relationships allowed local conflicts to escalate beyond control. Whatever the ultimate cause, the result was the end of the Bronze Age world that had produced the historical Troy, the sophisticated palace civilizations that had maintained trade, networks spanning continents gave way to smaller, more localized communities. Writing systems were abandoned, artistic traditions were lost, and much of the accumulated knowledge of centuries disappeared into what historians call the Greek Dark Age. It was only centuries later, as Greek civilization began to recover and rebuild, that the memory of Troy's destruction was transformed into the epic stories we know today. The historical conflict, whatever its true nature, became the foundation for explorations of honor, love, duty, and the human condition that continue to resonate with readers around the world. This transformation from history to myth reveals something profound about human nature. We need our stories to be larger than the mundane realities that inspired them. The actual fall of Troy, however dramatic it might have been for those who experienced it, was ultimately just another episode in the endless cycle of Bronze Age warfare. But Homer's Troy, with its tragic heroes and timeless themes, speaks to truths about human experience that transcend any particular historical moment. As you settle into the comfortable darkness of approaching sleep, consider how the past continues to live in our imagination. The real Troy lies buried beneath centuries of accumulated earth, its stones silent and its stories lost. But the Troy of our collective memory remains as vivid and powerful as ever, reminding us that sometimes the truth of the heart matters more than the facts of archaeology. The winds that once carried Greek ships to Troy's shore still blow across. The Dardanelles and the stars that witnessed the city's destruction still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. In the space between waking and sleeping, between history and dream, the walls of Troy rise again, and the eternal human drama of conflict and reconciliation plays out once more in the theater of our imagination. As twilight deepens around us, we follow the story of Troy beyond the boundaries of the ancient world, watching as this timeless tale wove itself into the very fabric of Western civilization. Like seeds carried on the wind, the stories of Hector and Achilles, of Helen and Paris, took root in new soil with each passing century, blooming again and again in forms both familiar and wonderfully unexpected. Let your mind drift back to the early medieval world, when the great libraries of antiquity had crumbled and much of classical learning survived only in scattered manuscripts copied by devoted monks. It was during these centuries, often called the Dark Ages, that the Troy story underwent one of its most fascinating transformations. Medieval audiences, who knew little of Homer's original Greek, encountered Troy through Latin adaptations and creative retellings that reshaped the ancient tale for a Christian world. Picture a medieval castle on a winter evening, snow falling softly outside, while nobles gather around a great fireplace to hear tales of distant lands and ancient heroes. The storyteller who rises to speak knows his audience well. These are men and women who understand the bonds of feudal loyalty, the codes of chivalric honor, and the complex politics of medieval warfare. So when he tells the story of Troy, he transforms Hector into a perfect knight, Paris into a courtly lover, and the siege itself into something resembling the elaborate castle warfare his listeners know from their own experience. The most influential of these medieval adaptations was the Roman de Troyes, composed by the French poet Benoit de Saint-Maur around 1160. This sprawling romance, nearly 30,000 lines long, presented Troy not as Homer's Bronze Age city, but as a gleaming medieval metropolis, complete with Gothic cathedrals, courtly ceremonies, and the elaborate rituals of chivalric culture. Benoit's Trojans were noble Christians fighting against pagan Greeks, a reversal that reflected the medieval tendency to see themselves as heirs to Troy rather than to classical Greece. These medieval versions of the Troy story spread throughout Europe with remarkable speed, translated and adapted into dozens of languages and literary traditions. Each culture found something different to emphasize in the ancient tale. The French focused on romantic love and courtly behavior, transforming the abduction of Helen into an elaborate tale of forbidden passion. The Germans emphasized loyalty and duty, making Hector's devotion to his city a model for feudal obligation. The English, always interested in political legitimacy, traced the founding of Britain back to Brutus, a supposed descendant of the Trojan hero Aeneas. This last tradition proved particularly enduring. Medieval chroniclers claimed that after Troy's fall, Aeneas's great-grandson Brutus had sailed west across the Mediterranean, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and north to an island inhabited only by giants, which he conquered and renamed Britain after himself. The story was complete fiction, but it gave the English a classical pedigree to rival that of any European dynasty, connecting them directly to the heroic age of antiquity through Trojan blood. As we move forward through the centuries, we find the Renaissance breathing new life into these ancient stories with the rediscovery of classical texts and the renewed interest in Greek and Roman literature. Scholars began to read Homer in the original Greek for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, comparing his version with the medieval romances that had dominated European culture. Yet rather than rejecting the later adaptations, Renaissance writers often tried to synthesize them, creating works that combined classical authority with medieval romance and contemporary concerns. William Shakespeare, that supreme interpreter of human nature, found in the Troy story a perfect vehicle for exploring the themes that fascinated him most deeply. His play Troilus and Cressida, written around 1602, presents a Troy that is simultaneously ancient and thoroughly Elizabethan, where Greek and Trojan warriors debate questions of honor and policy with the sophistication of Renaissance courtiers. Shakespeare's Troy is a place of moral ambiguity, where heroes prove less than heroic, and the great conflict reveals itself as an exercise in futility and human folly. The 17th and 18th centuries saw Troy transformed once again, this time into a symbol of classical perfection and rational order. The French court of Louis XIV commissioned elaborate operas and ballets based on Trojan themes, using the ancient stories to celebrate contemporary power and magnificence. Painters filled vast canvases with scenes of Trojan splendor, creating visions of the ancient city that owed more to Versailles than to any archaeological evidence. Yet it was also during this period that serious scholars began to question this historical basis of the Troy story in ways that would eventually lead to Schliemann's excavations. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason and evidence gradually undermined simple faith in the literal truth of ancient texts, even as it created new appreciation for their artistic and cultural value. The 19th century brought Romanticism and, with it, a renewed fascination with the emotional and mythological dimensions of the Troy story. Poets like Byron and Keats found in the ancient tales perfect expressions of their own preoccupations with beauty, mortality, and the tragic nature of human existence. The discovery of the historical Troy by Schliemann only intensified this romantic interest, providing tangible evidence that the world of legend had some basis in reality. As we approach our own time, Troy's presence in popular culture becomes ever more pervasive and diverse. The 20th century saw the ancient story adapted into novels, films, operas, and countless other forms of artistic expression. Each generation found new meanings in the old tales, using them to explore contemporary concerns about war, love, power, and human nature. The 1956 film Helen of Troy brought the story to Hollywood's golden age with spectacular battle scenes and romantic melodrama that made ancient warfare accessible to modern audiences. Later, the 2004 film Troy, starring Brad Pitt as Achilles, updated the story for the blockbuster era, emphasizing action and visual spectacle while exploring themes of heroism and mortality that resonated with contemporary viewers. Television has embraced Troy as well, with documentaries that blend archaeological evidence with dramatic recreations, and fictional series that reimagine the characters and conflicts for serialized storytelling. Each adaptation brings its own perspective, its own emphasis, its own understanding of what makes these ancient stories eternally relevant. Literature continues to find new ways to approach the Troy story, from feminist retellings that foreground the experiences of Helen, Cassandra, and other female characters, to postmodern novels that deconstruct the heroic narratives and examine their implications for contemporary readers. Writers like Pat Barker, with her novel The Silence of the Girls, have given voice to characters who remained largely silent in the original epics, exploring the human cost of war from perspectives that Homer barely acknowledged. Video games have created interactive versions of the Troy story, allowing players to command armies, make strategic decisions, and experience the siege from multiple perspectives. These digital adaptations represent perhaps the most radical departure from traditional storytelling, transforming passive audiences into active participants in the ancient drama. Even academic scholarship has become a form of cultural adaptation, as historians, archaeologists, and literary critics continue to reinterpret the Troy story in light of new evidence and evolving theoretical frameworks. Each scholarly study, each archaeological report, each critical essay adds another layer to our understanding of these ancient tales and their continuing relevance. What emerges from this long history of cultural adaptation is a Troy that has become simultaneously more and less than its original incarnation. More, because each new version adds richness and complexity to our collective understanding of the story. Less, because no single modern adaptation can capture the full cultural significance that these tales held for their original audiences. Yet perhaps this is exactly as it should be. Stories that truly matter are not museum pieces to be preserved unchanged, but living traditions that grow and evolve with each telling. The Troy that speaks to us today is not Homer's Troy, nor the medieval Troy of romance, nor the Renaissance Troy of classical learning, but a synthesis of all these versions and more, a story that has proven flexible, enough to accommodate the dreams and fears of dozens of generations. As you prepare to surrender to sleep's gentle embrace, consider how the stories we tell about the past reveal as much about ourselves as about ancient events. Each age finds in Troy the reflection of its own concerns, its own values, its own understanding of what it means to be human. The walls of Troy have been rebuilt countless times in human imagination, each reconstruction serving the needs of its particular moment while contributing to an ongoing conversation about love, war, honor, and destiny that spans more than 3 millennia. In your dreams tonight, you might glimpse all the Troys that have ever existed. The Bronze Age city of archaeological evidence, the medieval castle of romance, the Renaissance court of classical learning, and the Hollywood epic of popular entertainment. All are true in their own way, all are false in others, and all contribute to the magnificent tapestry of human storytelling. That makes these ancient tales as vivid and meaningful today as they were when Homer first sang of the wrath of Wrath, Achilles beneath the starlit skies of ancient Greece. As the night deepens around us, and we prepare to close this long meditation on Troy, we must ask ourselves the most important question of all. Why does this ancient story continue to captivate us? What is it about these Bronze Age walls and legendary heroes that speak so powerfully to the human soul, across cultures and centuries, in ways that transcend historical fact or archaeological evidence? Let yourself settle into the deepest comfort as we explore not the Troy of history books or museum displays, but the Troy that lives within us all, the eternal city of the human imagination, where our deepest hopes and fears play out their timeless drama against a backdrop of walls that can never truly fall because they are built from the stuff of dreams themselves. Troy endures because it represents something fundamental about the human condition, the tragic beauty of impermanence. Here was a city that seemed eternal, with walls built by gods and heroes who appeared invincible, yet it fell to the cleverness of a wooden horse and the passage of a single night. In Troy's destruction, we see reflected our own mortality, our own vulnerability, and the bittersweet knowledge that everything we build and love will eventually return to dust. But Troy also represents the opposite truth, that some things are indeed eternal, not in their physical form, but in their meaning and memory. The Bronze Age city crumbled into archaeological layers, but the Troy of human imagination has proven indestructible. Each time we tell the story, each time we read Homer or watch a film adaptation, each time we use phrases like Trojan horse or Achilles' heel in casual conversation, we rebuild those walls and populate them once again with their immortal inhabitants. Consider Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. In one sense, she is the ultimate victim, a woman whose beauty made her a prize to be won, fought over, and blamed for consequences far beyond her control. Medieval audiences saw her as a temptress, Renaissance poets as a symbol of perfect beauty, modern writers as a complex figure struggling with agency and identity. Yet in all these interpretations, Helen represents something that resonates deeply with human experience: the power of desire to transform lives, to justify great undertakings, and to serve as both inspiration and excuse for actions that might otherwise seem inexplicable. The truth is that Helen, historical or mythical, matters less than what she represents. The human tendency to locate the causes of our conflicts in external objects or people, rather than examining the desires and ambitions that drive us from within. Every age has its Helen, its supposedly irresistible prize that justifies great expenditures of effort and sacrifice. The genius of the Troy story is that it allows us to explore these patterns of desire and conflict in a setting distant enough to provide perspective, yet emotionally immediate enough to engage our deepest feelings. Hector embodies another eternal human archetype, the reluctant hero who fights not for glory or personal gain, but for duty and love of home. In a story filled with larger-than-life warriors pursuing personal honor, Hector stands apart as a man who would prefer peace but accepts the necessity of war when his community is threatened. His tenderness with his wife and son, his respectful relationship with his parents, his courtesy even toward his enemies, all these qualities make him perhaps the most admirable character in the entire epic. Yet Hector's nobility makes his fate all the more tragic. He knows from prophecy that Troy will fall, that his death will leave his family vulnerable, that his courage and skill cannot ultimately save the city he loves. His heroism lies not in ignorance of these facts, but in his determination to fulfill his responsibilities despite them. In Hector, we see reflected our own struggles to live with dignity and purpose, even when we know that our individual efforts cannot prevent the larger tragedies that await us all. Achilles represents a different kind of heroism, the pursuit of immortal glory at the cost of a long life and peaceful happiness. His choice between a long, obscure existence and a short, glorious one speaks to questions that every human faces in some form. How much of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice for our ambitions? What price are we willing to pay for recognition and remembrance? Is it better to be safely forgotten or dangerously remembered? The rage of Achilles that opens Homer's epic is simultaneously personal and universal. On one level, it springs from his specific grievance against Agamemnon over the distribution of war prizes. On a deeper level, it represents the fury that all humans feel when confronted with injustice, mortality, and the gap between our ideals and reality. Achilles' eventual reconciliation with Priam over Hector's body suggests that even the greatest anger can be transformed by shared recognition of human suffering and loss. Paris, often dismissed as a weak and selfish character, represents yet another aspect of the human experience, the power of passion to override judgment and the tendency to let personal desires trump social responsibilities. His love for Helen may have been genuine, but his inability to consider the consequences of his actions for others reflects a kind of moral blindness that we can recognize in ourselves and our contemporaries. Paris reminds us that not all human motivations are noble, and that some of our most consequential decisions spring from immediate desires rather than careful consideration. The city of Troy itself functions as more than just a setting for these human dramas. It represents the eternal human project of building something lasting and beautiful in the face of time's relentless passage. Every civilization has its Troy, its great achievement that embodies its highest aspirations and accomplishments. The walls of Troy, built by divine hands according to legend, represent humanity's recurring dream of creating something perfect and permanent. Yet the fall of Troy reminds us that all human achievements are temporary. The greatest cities crumble, the mightiest empires fade, the most beautiful works of art decay or disappear. This knowledge could lead to despair, but the Troy story suggests a different lesson, that the meaning of our creations lies not in their permanence, but in the human effort and aspiration they represent while they exist. The wooden horse, that masterpiece of deception that finally breached Troy's walls, carries its own profound symbolism. It represents the way that destruction often comes not through frontal assault, but through our own choices and blind spots. Troy's walls were strong enough to withstand any direct attack, but they could not protect against the Trojans' own decision to bring their doom inside. In this, we see reflected the way that individuals and societies often contribute to their own downfall through pride, wishful thinking, or the desire to believe in gifts that seem too good to be true. The horse also symbolizes the double-edged nature of human cleverness. Odysseus' stratagem saved Greek lives and won the war, but it did so through deception and betrayal of trust. A same intelligence that allows humans to solve problems and create beauty also enables us to devise new forms of destruction and manipulation. Every technological advance, every social innovation, every creative breakthrough carries within it the potential for both blessing and curse. Perhaps most importantly, Troy represents the mysterious alchemy by which historical events, whether real or imagined, transform into stories that carry meanings far beyond their original circumstances. The Bronze Age conflict that may have inspired Homer's epic was probably a relatively minor affair in the context of ancient Near Eastern politics. Yet through the power of storytelling, it became a lens through which countless generations have examined questions of love, war, duty, honor, and human nature. This transformation reveals something essential about how humans create meaning. We are storytelling creatures who understand ourselves and our world through narrative. The facts of what happened at Troy matter less than the truths about human experience that the story illuminates. Each retelling, each adaptation, each scholarly interpretation adds new layers of meaning while preserving the essential core that makes the story worth telling. Troy lives in the human heart because it offers no simple answers, but asks all the right questions. Is love worth the price of war? Can individual honor justify collective suffering? How do we balance personal desires with social responsibilities? What makes life meaningful in the face of inevitable death? These are questions that every generation must answer for itself, and the Troy story provides a rich framework for exploring them. The walls of Troy rise and fall eternally in human imagination because they represent our own internal conflicts and aspirations. We are all besiegers and besieged, heroes and victims, builders and destroyers. We all face choices between duty and desire, between safety and glory, between acceptance and resistance. In the end, Troy matters not because it was real or imagined, not because it happened in the Bronze Age or yesterday, but because it continues to offer insights into the eternal drama of being human. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you this thought. The Troy that matters most is not the one that archaeologists excavate or historians debate, but the one that lives in the collective human imagination as a symbol of everything noble and tragic about our condition. That Troy can never be destroyed because it is built from the indestructible materials of hope, memory, and the endless human need to find meaning in the midst of uncertainty. And so we come to the end of our long journey through the mists of time, back to this quiet moment where you rest in comfort, surrounded by the gentle darkness of night. We have traveled far together, from the wine-dark shores of the Aegean to the dusty excavation sites of modern archaeology, from Homer's firelit halls to Hollywood's glittering screens, from the realm of pure legend to the patient accumulation of historical evidence. Let yourself sink deeper into that peaceful space, between waking and sleeping, where the boundaries between story and reality grow soft and permeable. Here, in this twilight realm of consciousness, all the Troys we have encountered can coexist. The Bronze Age city of archaeological fragments, the medieval castle of chivalric romance, the Renaissance court of classical learning, and the eternal symbol that lives in the deepest chambers of human imagination. As your breathing slows and your muscles release their hold on the day's tensions, listen with the ear of the heart to the whispers that still drift across the centuries from that ancient shore. Do you hear them? The sound of waves against wooden ships drawn up on a pebbled beach, the creak of rope and timber as siege engines are assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, the soft murmur of voices planning desperate strategies around dying campfires. But listen more closely still, and you will hear other sounds, the laughter of children playing in Troy streets before the war began, the songs of women weaving at their looms, the conversations of merchants haggling over prices in the marketplace. These quieter sounds remind us that Troy was more than just a stage for heroic drama. It was home to thousands of ordinary people whose lives and loves and daily concerns were no less real for being forgotten by history. Tonight, as you prepare to surrender to sleep's gentle embrace, you join an unbroken chain of dreamers that stretches back through countless generations. In the bedchambers of medieval castles, nobles once drifted toward slumber with tales of Trojan knights dancing in their minds. In Renaissance palazzos, scholars fell asleep contemplating the classical wisdom they had rediscovered in ancient texts. In Victorian parlors, families gathered around the hearth to hear once more the timeless stories of love and war, duty and betrayal. Each of these dreamers added something to the continuing story of Troy, interpreting its meaning through the lens of their own experience, their own hopes and fears, and understanding of what it means to be human. You are part of that tradition now, carrying forward the ancient conversation between past and present, between the world as it was and the world as we imagine it might have been. The wooden horse that we explored earlier still stands in imaginations. Troy, but perhaps now you can see it differently. It is no longer just a clever stratagem or a symbol of deception. It has become something larger, a reminder that the most profound changes often come not through force, but through the unexpected, through the gifts we choose to accept, through the doors we choose to open in our own carefully constructed walls. Think of all the wooden horses in your own life, the opportunities that appeared disguised as risks, the strangers who became friends, the challenges that seemed like obstacles but proved to be openings to new possibilities. Like the Trojans, we are constantly making choices about what to let inside the walls of our carefully ordered existence. Sometimes we choose wisely, sometimes not, but always we are choosing. Always we are writing the next chapter of our own ongoing epic. The heroes we have met on this journey: Achilles with his divine rage and mortal vulnerability, Hector with his quiet courage and family devotion, Helen with her dangerous beauty and complex motivations, all continue their eternal drama in the theater of human imagination. But they do so now with your participation, your understanding, your own interpretation of their struggles and choices. You have seen how archaeologists like Schliemann brought passion and determination to the patient work of uncovering the past. You have witnessed how each age has found its own Troy, its own meaning in these ancient stories. You have explored the possibility that beneath all the layers of myth and interpretation lies the memory of real people who faced real challenges not unlike our own. As your eyelids grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift like ships on a calm sea, consider this final gift from the ancient storytellers: the recognition that some truths are too large to be contained in any single version of events. The Troy that mattered to Homer was not the same Troy that inspired Virgil, which was not the same Troy that captivated medieval audiences, which was not the same Troy that Hollywood brought to millions of modern viewers. Yet all these Troys are true in their own way because they all serve the same fundamental human need: the need to find meaning in struggle, beauty in loss, hope in the face of inevitable change. The walls of Troy have been rebuilt countless times in human imagination because we need those walls to exist, need that city to stand as a reminder of everything noble and tragic about the human condition. The real secret of Troy's enduring power is not that it provides answers, but that it asks better questions. In pondering the choices made by Paris and Helen, we examine our own relationship with desire and responsibility. In following Hector's struggle to balance duty and family, we explore our own competing loyalties. In witnessing Achilles' choice between glory and longevity, we confront our own mortality and the legacy we hope to leave behind. These questions have no final answers, because they are not the kind of questions that can be solved once and for all. They are living questions that each generation must engage with anew, finding their own responses based on their own circumstances and understanding. This is why Troy never grows old, never becomes irrelevant, never loses its power to move and instruct us. As sleep approaches on quiet feet, bringing with it the realm of dreams where all stories are equally real and equally imagined, let yourself become part of Troy's continuing story. In your dreams, you might walk the ancient streets before the war began, when the city was at peace and the future seemed bright with possibility. You might stand on the walls with Hector, looking out over the plain where destiny waits with bronze, spear and divine purpose. Or perhaps you will find yourself among the Greek ships, listening to Achilles tune his lyre and sing of heroes whose fame has outlasted their earthly lives. Maybe you will witness the construction of the wooden horse, understanding at last both the terrible necessity and the tragic consequences of that final desperate stratagem. But most likely, your dreams will create their own version of Troy, blending memory and imagination, history and hope, ancient wisdom and contemporary insight in ways that are uniquely your own. This is as it should be, for Troy belongs not to any single dreamer, but to all who have ever wondered about the meaning of heroism, the price of love, the nature of honor, and the mysterious alchemy that transforms ordinary human lives into timeless stories. The sound of waves against the Trojan shore grows softer now, fading into the rhythm of your own breathing, the beating of your own heart. The voices of ancient heroes blend with the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant hum of the modern world settling into its own version of peaceful sleep. Rest now, knowing that Troy's story continues in your dreams and in your waking thoughts, in the choices you make and the values you hold dear. The city that may have fallen 3,000 years ago lives on in every act of courage, every moment of tenderness, every decision to choose duty over ease or love over safety. The wooden horse still echoes in the corridors of time, its hoofbeats, marking not the end of Troy's story, but its eternal beginning. Each night, as consciousness fades and dreams take hold, the walls rise again, the heroes take their places, and the great drama of human aspiration and limitation begins anew. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are part of that continuing story, a keeper of the flame that has burned bright across the centuries, connecting us all to the best and most enduring parts of our shared human heritage. In your dreams tonight, Troy awaits, not as it was, but as it always might be, forever balanced on the edge between history and hope, between memory and imagination, between the mortal city that time claimed and the immortal city that lives, forever in the human heart. Sweet dreams, fellow traveler. May your rest be peaceful and your dreams be filled with the ancient wisdom that whispers still from those legendary walls, carrying forward the eternal human story of love and loss, courage and consequence, and the endless, beautiful struggle to create meaning in the face of time's relentless passage.